Welcome to every single book I read in 2024 reviewed in one sentence or less. Starting with Hollow City, this is the second book in the Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. I rated this a 3-star. I found it a little bit hard to get into at first, but then I realized I probably should have reread the first book before just jumping into this one. So then I reread the first book, which is Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. Also rated this a 3-star. This was a reread, but it was just as good as I remembered it being. And then I read It Ends With Us, which I ended up rating a 1-star. I have no idea how that book became so popular, with it being so problematic and having no trigger warning, when it really should have had a trigger warning. And then I read Spare by Prince Harry, which this might be one of my least favorite memoirs. I did really enjoy like the whole prince aspect and like learning about the royal family, but I just found this book way too redundant for me. I also kind of felt like I didn't hear his voice in the memoir. It felt like someone else wrote it, which was kind of sad. And then I read The Subtle Art of Not Giving a. I also found this book way too long. It could have been like a little pamphlet and been perfectly fine. I still could have gotten the same amount of information from the book if it was just a little pamphlet. The author also made a comment about a woman in the book that I just cannot forgive that he made that comment. It just really rubbed me the wrong way. And then I read Iron Flame, which was my first 5-star of the year. This was the perfect mix of fantasy and romance for me. I fell in love with all of the characters in the first book, so this book was just vibes the entire time. Like I just loved it. Plus the ending. And then I read It Starts With Us by Colleen Hoover. I also rated this a 1-star, and I have no idea why I even bothered reading this book when I didn't like It Ends With Us. I don't know why I did that. I guess maybe I was looking for a hate read. I have no idea. And then I read The Glass Castle by Jeanette Walls. This was a memoir. I rated it 4 stars. This was the most lyrical memoir I have ever read. Her writing was so good, and I had to keep reminding myself that this was her real life. This was not a made-up story. And then I read Library of Souls, which is the 3rd book of the Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children series. I rated this a 3.5 stars. I thought it was a little bit slow at times, but the ending was exactly what I was looking for. And then I read the 4th book in the same series, which is called A Map of Days. I rated this a 3-star, and I also feel like this is the part of the series where I realized that YA might be just not for me, at least this kind of YA, because this was like very young YA, and I was just kind of uncomfortable about reading younger kids because they started like giving romantic interests in this book, and I was like, no thank you. And then I reread Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. Obviously I love these books, and I reread this entire series both at the end of 2023 and then into the beginning of 2024. Like I mentioned, I also reread Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix this year. Again, love this book, 5 stars. And then I read Loathe to Love You by Ali Hazelwood. I actually really liked this book, even though I gave it a 3.5 star. There's 3 novellas in this book. One of them I loved. The other 2 were just kind of middle of the road. And then I read Hello Stranger, which I gave a 3-star. I think I hyped this book up a little bit too much in my head. It was still really good, but I also wouldn't classify this book as a romance. And then I read Love Theoretically by Ali Hazelwood. I think that this might be my least favorite Ali Hazelwood book. I don't know why, I just couldn't connect to the characters at all, which made it hard to root for them romantically. And then I actually listened to A Tale as Old as Time. I rated this a 3.5 star. This is a Beauty and the Beast retelling, and this author definitely has some type of contract with Disney because the beginning of the book was very similar to the original Beauty and the Beast story, but then the end just got so dark and I just was not into that. And then I reread Cinder by Marissa Meyer. This is definitely a 5-star read for me. I love this entire series. This is the Lunar Chronicles series, and this was a retelling of Cinderella, so we have 2 retellings back to back. I love a good fairy tale retelling. And then I read Plum Tea Crazy. I don't read a ton of cozy mysteries, so this was me kind of branching out into cozy mysteries, and I rated this a 2.5 star, and I just could not get into this book. I remember thinking that there were just way too many murder suspects all at one time, and it was just too much, and I feel like the reveal was kind of rushed at the end, and I kind of feel like cozy mysteries might just be a little bit too low stakes for me. And then I listened to The Teacher by Freida McFadden, which I rated 4 stars. This was a thriller with an insane twist at the end that will leave you like, you know? And then back to my Harry Potter rereads. I again reread Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, and I reread Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. These are just comfort books for me at this point. And then I read / listened to Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. I read probably the first like 50% of this book, and then I had to switch to the audiobook because I just was not enjoying it, but I also didn't want to not finish it at the same time. I just found it a little bit boring, but it was a classic, so I wanted to give it some grace and at least give the whole book a try. And then I read another classic, which is Pride and Prejudice. I ended up rating this a 3.5 star, and I actually want to reread this book this year because I remember really enjoying it, but then I also just completely forgot everything that happened, which is shocking. So I don't know, I definitely want to reread this. That was also my first Jane Austen book, and I really liked her writing, so I'm very excited to read some more by her. And then I listened to When the Emperor Was Divine, and I ended up rating this a 3-star. This was about the Japanese camps in America during World War II. It's a very short book, so I felt like because it was so short I couldn't connect to the characters as much as I wanted to, so I actually wish that this book was longer because I feel like I would have liked it more if it was longer. And then I listened to The Woman in Me Me by Britney Spears, and I gave this a 5-star. I just love a good celebrity memoir, and Britney Spears' story is crazy, just so interesting. And the way that she wrote this book, loved it. I could just hear her voice. Felt like she wrote this book, if you know what I mean. And then I read Anxious People. This was my first book by him, and I really enjoyed it. I rated it 4 stars. It was such a good read. He has such a unique writing style. This book is basically about a robber situation turned hostage, but it's not going to be what you expect it to be when I say that. I need to move these books around. I feel like you cannot see me. And then I read The True Love Experiment by Christina Lauren. I ended up giving this a 3 stars. This was a really cute idea for a book. It was kind of like DNA testing mixed with The Bachelorette. I just wasn't super obsessed with it. And then I read The Honey Don't List by Christina Lauren, and I rated this a 2 stars. I just couldn't stop thinking about the fact that this reminded me so much of an HGTV show, and they were like dissing the couple in the book, which just reminded me of that HGTV show. So it just kind of sat weird with me. And then I read Made in Manhattan by Lauren Lane. I feel like this book is so underhyped. I rated this a 4 star. This was one of my favorite romances. It was so cute. It was kind of enemies to lovers, and also had that New York scene, which is just the cherry on top for me. I'm also just obsessed with this couple. It was a short read, but it didn't feel too insta-lovey. And then I listened to None of This Is True by Lisa Jewell. I ended up rating this a 4 star, and I loved listening to it because a lot of this book is a podcast, so it just kind of felt right to listen to it. And then I read the entire Good Girls Guide to Murder trilogy. So I started with A Good Girls Guide to Murder, which I rated 4 stars. It's a YA mystery thriller, very good, and I did not guess any of the plot twists in these books. And then I read Good Girl Bad Blood, which is the second book. I liked that it kind of followed a similar plotline from the first book, but it was more of like a subplot. Really liked this one as well. And then my favorite book from the trilogy was As Good as Dead. I rated this a 5 star. The way that this book just twists and turns all the time, it was so good. And then I listened to Killjoy, which is technically the prequel to this series. I don't know why I read it last. It kind of felt unnecessary to read it last, so I don't really fully recommend this book. I feel like you can just stick to the OG trilogy. You don't really need to read this book. And then I listened to Finley Donovan Is Killing It, which I rated this a 4 star, and I was not expecting to like this book as much as I did. It's the first book in a series, and I was literally laughing out loud during this book. It was so good. It's almost like a rom-com mixed with a mystery, which I've never read anything like that before. And then I read My Sister's Keeper, and I rated this a 2.5 star. The ending of this book made me so mad and so upset that I bumped it down an entire star rating, so I just don't think I recommend this book. And then I read A Little Life, which I rated 4 stars, but this is probably the saddest book that I have ever read in my entire life, so I definitely recommend checking the trigger warnings if you're thinking about reading this book. The writing was just so good that I ended up liking it so much, but also it broke my heart. And then I read the second Finley Donovan Is Killing It book, which is Finley Donovan Knocks Up Dead, and I rated this a 4 star. I also listened to this one because the narrator is so good in this entire series, and you get a little bit more romance in this book than you did the first one, which I was really hoping for. And I just love how these characters are constantly getting into trouble. And then I listened to The Unfortunate Side Effects of Heartbreak and Magic, which I ended up giving a 2 star. And maybe I would have liked this book a little bit more if I read it more in the fall time / Halloween. But the main character in this book just irked me so much. She just annoyed me. And I almost DNF'd this book multiple times. I don't know why I didn't. I probably should have. And then this is when I started the Throne of Glass series. I actually started with Throne of Glass. I don't love the way that I read these books, so I don't recommend my reading order, which you'll kind of see. My reading order seems all over the place, but I did the reading order that Sarah J Maas recommended on her website. But I gave this one a 4 star. I really liked the competition element of this book. And then I actually listened to Tom Lee, which I ended up giving a 3 stars. I wasn't obsessed with this book. I also had kind of higher expectations because I feel like a lot of people really liked this book. I just didn't really understand the hype, but also I feel like I would have liked this book more if I read it versus listened to it, because I didn't love the narration of it. And then since I read Britney Spears' memoir, I feel like I also had to listen to her sister's memoir, which is Things I Should Have Said. Yeah, I didn't love this, and I really understood the controversy after I read it. I was like, oh, yeah, I get it now. And then I read Crown of Midnight, which is the second book in the Throne of Glass series. I rated this a 4 star, and I only lost points because I guessed the cliffhanger that happens on the very last page of the book, which I hate when that happens. And then I read A Summer Affair by Ellen Hildebrand, which I rated a 4 stars. I was actually shocked that I liked this book so much because I hate cheating in books. I don't know why. This one just did it for me. I think I just love Ellen Hildebrand. And then I listened to Finley Donovan Jumps the Gun, which is the third book in the series. This one also had a good romance in it, and the dynamic between all the characters is just so good. And then I read The Reappearance of Rachel Price. I think that this is my least favorite Holly Jackson book, but I still really enjoyed it, and I rated it a 4 star. This is a YA mystery thriller, and I think anything that Holly Jackson comes out with I'm gonna read. So I don't think I've rated any of her YA mystery thriller books less than 4 stars. And then I read Beach beach read by Emily Henry, which I'm still confused. There's no beach in this book unless there is and I just missed that. This book was just perfect. I am obsessed with Gus in January. And then I read The Newcomer by Mary Kate Andrews. I think that this is my least favorite Mary Kate Andrews book. I don't know why. I just could not connect to this book. And the romance in it just felt kind of weird to me, and it kind of came out of nowhere. Like, it went from 0 to 100 way too fast. Hopefully that stack doesn't fall over because it's wobbly. And then I read Into the Abyss. This is a nonfiction book that I rated 5 stars. One of my favorite nonfiction books. I didn't feel like I was reading a textbook at all, which I get a little bit nervous about reading nonfiction because I don't want it to feel like a textbook. This one was not like that at all. Very interesting story, but I definitely don't recommend this book if you're about to get on a plane, because I read it and I was like, thank goodness that I'm not flying anywhere anytime soon, because it's about a plane crash. That's probably an important note. And then I read The Therapist, which I rated 5 stars, and this ended up being one of my favorite thrillers from this year. I literally could not stop talking about this book. I could not stop recommending it after I read it. I just loved it so much, and I feel like this book deserves so much more hype than it gets. And then I read A Stranger in the House, which is another thriller, and I rated this one a 3 star. And I honestly feel like I might have liked this book a little bit better if I didn't read it right after The Therapist, because The Therapist was just so good. Nothing could compare to it. But I found this one to be just a little bit lackluster for me. And then I read Magnolia Park. This is the first book in the Magnolia universe, and I rated this a 4 star. It was so good. If you like Gossip Girl, I highly recommend this book. Just know that it is a toxic romance. I feel like that definitely helps going into the book, knowing that it's a toxic romance. But they remind me so much of Blair and Chuck, and I just love Gossip Girl, so it felt like Gossip Girl in a book. And then I listened to The Guncle, which I rated 3.5 stars. This was so good. The audiobook was amazing. It was the perfect mix of lighthearted, but also manages to discuss some heavy themes in it. And like I said, the narration was perfect. And then I listened to Normal People by Sally Rooney, and I rated this a 3 star. And call me crazy, but this book was way too odd for me. I did not like the characters. I didn't like the romance. I don't really understand the hype, to be honest. And then I read The House Across the Lake by Riley Sager, and I rated this a 2.5 star. This was my least favorite Riley Sager book. Just did not like it. The plot twist made absolutely zero sense to me and actually made me mad. And then I read Assassin's Blade, and like I talked about earlier, the reading order was so odd. I'm sorry, Miss Sarah J. Maas. I don't know why she recommends this reading order, but yeah, I read this one right before I read Air or Fire. I don't know. No idea. But this one unfortunately was one of my least favorites of the series, and I'm not really sure why. I just couldn't really connect to it. And then I listened to Veronica Roon's Breaks the Bank, which is a little novella inside of the Finley Donovan is Killing It series. I didn't love this one. I ended up rating it a 3 star. And then I read the entire Heartstopper series, and I'm just gonna talk about them all at the same time. This is such a cute graphic novel series, and you're following 2 boys and their relationship throughout all of high school. I really liked the series, but I honestly recommend it more for early high school, middle school ages, which I'm pretty sure it's technically a YA anyway. And then I listened to Finley Donovan Rolls the Dice, which unfortunately was one of my least favorites of the series. I rated this a 3 star, but again, I still highly recommend this entire series, and I loved the audiobooks. And then I read Queen of Shadows, which I ended up rating a 4.5 stars. There was just one thing that happens in this book that I really didn't like, which was holding it back from a 5 star, which I obviously can't tell you what it is because we're so far deep into the series that it would spoil it. And then I listened to Behind the Scenes, My Life in Rhinestones by Dolly Parton. I didn't end up rating this book, but if you like Clothes or Dolly Parton, I highly recommend this one. And the book is narrated by her, which I feel like just makes it so much better. And then I read Ilona Inversion's Rules for Commuting. I rated this a 2.5 star. I did not love this book. The characters felt way too 2D and everything was tied together way too nicely. It just didn't feel realistic at all to me. And then I read Red, White, and Royal Blue. I rated this a 3 star, but I honestly think I would lower this rating now. I don't know if it's because I read it in an election year or what was going on, but I just couldn't connect to this book at all. And then I read The Castaways by Ellen Hildebrand. You already know I love Ellen Hildebrand, but I did not love this book. I ended up rating it a 2 star. And at its core, this book is not bad. I've talked about it before. I do not like cheating in books, and this book painted cheating in such a good light that it made me uncomfortable, and I really didn't like that. Like, the characters had no repercussions for their actions, or not enough repercussions, which just sat wrong with me. And then I read Little Bee. This book shocked me. I ended up rating it a 5 star. I had no expectations going into this book, and I feel like that's why I ended up rating it so highly. I was shocked at how much I ended up loving these characters, and I was so invested in them, but 100% recommend checking the trigger warnings before you read this book. And then I read Divine Rivals, and I rated this a 5 star. It's magical typewriter meets romance meets fantasy war. I don't know what else I could ask for in a book. I just loved that so much. And then I read The Perfect Couple by Ellen Hildebrand. I really liked this book. I rated it a 4 star and I almost gave it a 5 star. The only thing holding this book back was the ending. The ending made me so mad, and I'm glad that the TV show ends differently than the book does. And then I read The Timekeeper's Secret, which I ended up rating a 2 star. I feel like I've talked about this book a lot this year, so I don't want to dwell on it, but I just didn't love it, didn't vibe with the writing style, didn't vibe with what happens in the book, just not for me. And then I listened to The Marlowe Murder Club and I rated this a 3 star. It wasn't bad by any means, but it just reminded me a lot of Sherlock Holmes, at least the first Sherlock Holmes book, so I decided not to continue this series because I would rather continue the Sherlock Holmes series. And then I read Carnegie's Maid, which I rated a 5 star. This was just everything I was looking for in a historical fiction, and it had a little subplot of romance, which I always just love. And then I listened to Beautiful Boy. This was a memoir and this was very sad. I decided not to rate this one because I had to keep pausing it and taking breaks just because I found this book so sad. Okay, this is gonna fall. This is gonna fall. And then I read 28 Summers by Ellen Hildebrand. I don't know what is up with Miss Ellen, but she loves to write about cheating in her books. And in this book, they literally meet up once a year for 28 years. And they just cheat a lot, obviously. But I ended up liking this book so much. I was shocked. I gave this a 5 star. And I was upset that I liked this book so much because of the cheating, but it was just so good. And then I read A Study in Scarlet, which I kind of alluded to earlier. This is the first book in the Sherlock Holmes series. I rated this a 3 star, and I did really like this book. The only thing was it's kind of separated into 2 parts. The first part I really liked. The second part fell very flat for me. And then I read The Sixth Wedding, which is a novella that follows 28 Summers, and it actually made what happens in 28 Summers and the cheating in that book even worse. So I rated this a 3 star. If you like 28 Summers but you didn't like the cheating part of 28 Summers, this book will make that 100 times worse. And then I listened to The Guncle Abroad, which is the second book in the Guncle series. Rated this a 4 star. It was so good. Like I said with the first book, it just manages to cover so many topics, but also managed to be lighthearted. And the author narrates these books and he does such an amazing job. And then I listened to The Swan Song by Ellen Hildebrand. This is the last book in her Nantucket series, which I read the entire series this year. And I actually think that this was my least favorite book in the series, or second least favorite book actually. It just wasn't my favorite. It wasn't bad by any means. I've just experienced better from her, so I know that she can do better. And then I listened to Talking as Fast as I Can, From Gilmore Girls to Gilmore Girls. Highly recommend listening to this one, which I love listening to any memoir, but this one I just loved hearing her voice. It literally made me feel like I was listening to Lorelai Gilmore speaking. I just love celebrity memoirs and hearing about like the behind the scenes of the acting world. And then I also listened to The Unmaking of June Farrow. I rated this a 3 star, and I feel like part of the problem was that this book was getting so much hype when I listened to it that my expectations were really high. I also just didn't love the narrator, so I feel like if I read this physically I would have liked it a little bit more. And then I listened to Lauren Graham's other memoir, which is titled Have I Told You This Already? Stories That I Don't Want to Forget to Remember. I also really enjoyed this one, but I think I enjoyed her first memoir a little bit better. And then I read Tower of Dawn and Empire of Storms. I did the tandem read, so I read these books both at the same time because they take place at the same time. I rated both of these books a 4 star, and I loved reading these books at the same time, even though I do feel like I liked Tower of Dawn a little bit better, which might surprise a lot of people because I feel like a lot of people don't love this book, but there's a lot of action, a lot of things happen in both of these books, and I enjoyed them both. And then I read Kingdom of Ash, which is the last book in the series, and I was thoroughly disappointed in this book, and I still am to this day. This book just sat so wrong with me because I was so disappointed in it, but I will say my expectations were very high for this book because I feel like everyone loves this book, but I did not like it, which I'm just very sad about because I feel like at this point in the series, after reading 7 books about these characters, I should love the last book, and I didn't. So that was sad. And then I read The Divine Comedy, which I don't think I'm gonna give a rating because I have no idea what I would rate this book. This is a classic, and you could literally sit and dissect this book for like days and days and days because there's just so much in this book, and it kind of felt oddly real to read. But if you like classics and you like to sit and digest your books, I highly recommend this one. And then I read You Again, and I rated this a 4-star. I think people compare this book a lot to When Harry Met Sally, which I've seen that movie and I did like it. I just don't remember a lot of that movie. But I will say the main character in this book is a little bit annoying. I promise if you just stick it out, you'll get used to her character, and I feel like you'll really like this book. And then I read The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, which actually was recommended to me, but I read this book because it was on the Rory Gilmore Reading Challenge. I rated this a 3.5 star, and I really liked the beginning of this book, but the second half of the book really fell off for me. And I feel like that was mostly because the first half of this book, the plot just was very different than the second half, and I didn't love the plot in the second half. And then I read Coraline. I rated this a 4-star, but this book kind of felt like a reread for me because I've seen the movie so so many times when I was younger, but I had no idea that this was a book. So it kind of just felt like a nostalgic read for me. And then I read The Full Moon Coffee Shop. Honestly, I only picked this book up because it had cats on the cover, and I loved the way that the cats were incorporated into the story. I just didn't love how much astrology was in this book because I'm not super into astrology. But if you are into astrology, I think you would really like this book. And then I read A Novel Love Story. I rated this a 4.5 stars. It was nowhere close to being on the same level as A 7 Year Slip. That is still 100% one of my favorite books of all time. But I really liked the magical realism mixed with romance element that Ashley Poston does in her books. And then I read The Devil Wears Prada. I rated this a 4 star. I actually really enjoyed this book. I feel like most people have no idea that this book even exists. They just kind of know about the movie, but I really liked the book, and then I watched the movie right after. This is actually a series, so I'm excited to read more of the series, hopefully this year. And then I read Ruthless Vows, which is the second book in the little Divine Rivals duology. I rated this a 3.5 star. I did really enjoy this book. I just didn't like it as much as Divine Rivals. And then I read The Perfect Place to Die, which I rated 2.5 stars. I just did not love this book. I found it very predictable, even though it was based on a true story, which I had no idea anything about the true story. So if you know the true story that this book follows, you're definitely going to be able to guess where this book is going. And then I read Home Before Dark by Riley Sager, and I ended up giving this a 4 star. I have changed my rating on this book so many times because the plot twist made me mad, but then the more that I thought about the plot twist, I was like, yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. And I really liked this book, and I still think about this book to this day, and I actually really want my boyfriend to read this book because I think he would enjoy it, and I also just want someone to talk to about this book. And then I read Phantasma, which I give it 3 stars. This was a romantasy, and I really liked the fantasy competition element of this book, but the romance felt a little bit, it felt too physical at times. Definitely not for younger audiences. But I felt like those parts of the book were kind of holding it back from the emotional connection. And then I read Mindfulness. It's an 8-week plan for finding peace in a frantic world. This book was actually recommended to me, and I really enjoyed it. And then I read The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. I gave this a 5 stars. It was by far my favorite book of the year. It's historical fiction, and I fell in love with historical fiction this year. And also just Kristen Hanna's writing in general was so good. You're following 2 sisters during World War II and their story, and following like that woman's point of view during World War II. It was so good. And then I read A Thousand Boy Kisses, and I rated this book a 3 star, but I honestly feel like I would maybe possibly lower my rating. I just really did not like how young they were in the beginning part of the book. It just sat weird with me for the entire book, which I don't want to say what happens in the beginning of the book because I don't want to spoil anything, but if you know, you know why that would make me a little bit uncomfortable. And then I read Night Road by Kristen Hanna. I give this a 3 star. I think that this was one of my least favorite Kristen Hanna books. I still really enjoyed the writing, but I just found the plot a little bit too predictable. And then I read A Thousand Broken Pieces. I rated this a 3.5 star. I liked it a little bit better than A Thousand Boy Kisses, and this is the book that follows that book. And in this book, you follow the main character from A Thousand Boy Kisses, her sister. And I really liked her story and like her romantic interest. And then I read The Great Alone by Kristen Hanna. And at first, I really did not enjoy this book. There's some themes in here that you definitely need to check the trigger warnings on, and I didn't love those themes in this book. But the more I read this book, I just ended up really falling in love with it, and even to this day, I still think about this book. They live in Alaska in this book, which is such an interesting setting for a book, and obviously like I've never been to Alaska, I've never lived in Alaska. Their experiences in Alaska I think about all the time. And then I read Fifth Avenue Glamour Girl. I gave this a 5 star. I think I just really loved the historical fiction element of this, and Estee Lauder being in this story, and you kind of follow Estee and one of her close friends, which I think the friend is like a made-up story, but a lot of the Estee Lauder part is real and it actually happened, so I found that really interesting. And then I read Winter Street by Ellen Hildebrand. This is the first book in her winter series. I gave this a 4 star. This one is very Christmassy, so I recommend reading this around the Christmas time, but there's something about this book that I just ate up. I loved it so much. This was definitely one of my favorites in this winter series. And then I read When the Wind Blows by James Patterson. I rated this a 2.5 star. I just really didn't like it. I didn't love the ending or where things ended up progressing in the book. I think that this is a science fiction maybe, and I haven't read a lot of science fiction, so I'm not sure that this genre is really for me. And then I read Winter Stroll, which is the second book in the winter series. I rated this a 3 star. I didn't love it. It just felt a little bit too fluffy, and I wish that we had picked up where the first book ended. We didn't. We picked up like a year later, so I felt like I was missing a lot of information. Then I listened to The Surrogate Mother by Freida McFadden, and I I normally love Freida McFadden, but I did not love this book, mostly just because I found it a little bit too predictable. And then I read Daisy Haynes. I also rated this one a 3-star. I didn't love this one. I just felt like it was a little bit too repetitive because it's taking place during the first Magnolia book. So it felt like I had already kind of experienced these things. I didn't feel like I needed to experience them from Daisy's perspective as well. So I don't know. I kind of hope that the rest of the series isn't like that, but we'll see. And maybe I'll kind of get used to the way that that's set up. And then I read Powerless by Lauren Roberts. I gave this a 5-star. I had very high expectations for this book, and this book met and exceeded every single one of my expectations because I heard so many good things about this book. This was one of my favorite romanticies of the year, and I don't always love romantasy, but this one was really good. And then I read Winter Storms again by Ellen Hildebrand. I can't remember if this one was my least favorite or the one before was my least favorite, but I definitely recommend this entire winter series by Ellen Hildebrand. I read them all like back to back, so they all have kind of mixed up a little bit in my brain. And then I listened to The Only One Left by Riley Sager. I rated this one a 3.5 stars. All of Riley Sager's books are starting to get jumbled up in my head because I read so many Riley Sager books this year, but I'm convinced no one can guess Riley Sager's plot twists. And then I read Always in December. I think that this was by far my least favorite holiday book that I've ever read. The beginning of this book started out so good, and then the plot just went way into left field, and I did not like that. And then I read Once Upon a Royal Christmas. I gave this a 3-star. This is actually produced by Hallmark Publishing, and it is literally a Hallmark movie in a book. So if that's what you're looking for from a Christmas book, then I recommend this one. If that's not what you're looking for, I would stay very far from this book. And then I read Bright Lights Big Christmas by Mary Kay Andrews, and I've got to say, Mary Kay Andrews knows how to write a good Christmas book. Both Christmas books that I've read from her are just so good. And then I read The Third Gilmore Girl by Kelly Bishop. I loved this book so much. I listened to it because she narrates it. This is her memoir. I rated this a 5-star. It was so good, and just the way that this book ended, she kind of gives a little bit of advice at the end. It made me love her as a person because I already love her character in Gilmore Girls. Her life was so interesting. She actually started as a professional dancer. So if you like Gilmore Girls, highly, highly recommend this book. And then I read Academy of Villains. I was actually given the arc of this book, and I rated this a 3.5 star. I really liked this book. The beginning was reminding me a lot of Harry Potter, but then the plot diverges a lot from that, and I'm very excited to see where the rest of the series goes. And then I read Big Little Lies by Liane Moriarty. I gave this a 3.5 star. I really like Liane Moriarty's writing. I just didn't love this book and the plot line of this book. And then I reread Scarlet, which is the second book in the Lunar Chronicles. I really enjoyed this book. And like I said earlier, these all follow a different retelling. So this is the Little Red Riding Hood retelling, and I'm just very excited to keep reading this series. It's just such a good series. And then I read The Hobbit, which I ended up giving this book a 3-star, but I might bump it up to a 3.5. I'm not sure. Classics are just a little bit hard for me, but I will say I think I liked the book better than I liked the movie. And I don't know if I talked about The Maze Runner, but for some reason this is sitting in front of me, so it makes me feel like I forgot to talk about this book. But I also reread this book this year, and I just remember loving the movie so much when I was younger that I bought all the books, and I don't think I ever ended up reading all the books. I think I only read this one and the second one. That is all 122 books that I read this year, reviewed in a single sentence. Well, mostly a single sentence, but I hope you all enjoyed this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!